singer, dance, all around talented person.
Man, picture this. Two voices, two souls, locked in love and music. Solid, solid as a rock. You know that song, right? It became the anthem of weddings, anniversaries, real love. But behind that classic stood a man named Nick Ashford, a songwriter, a performer, a visionary. He wasn't just singing about love, he was living it. He and Valerie Simpson wrote the very songs that shaped Motown, that carried Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell, and Diana Ross straight into history. And yet, here's the wild part. Even with all those hits, all that magic, Nick Ashford's name still doesn't sit where it should among the legends. Why did the industry overlook him? Why hasn't the world fully honored him? That's crazy, man. This is the story of Nick Ashford. Let's get into it right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Man, before the world ever saw him rocking the stage with Valerie Simpson, before the fame, before solid, Nicholas Ashford was just a skinny kid trying to find his way in a world that didn't always seem built for him. Born in Fairfield, South Carolina, in 1941, Nick's early years were filled with the kind of challenges that could have broken a lesser spirit. His family didn't have much, you know. This wasn't silver spoons and easy streets. His father worked long, grinding hours, and his mother held the family together with pure grit. The Ashfords, like so many black families of that era, carried both the heavy weight of segregation and the quiet dignity of survival. When Nick was still a boy, his family made the move to Harlem, New York. And man, Harlem in the 1940 period wasn't just a neighborhood, it was an energy, a pulse. The remnants of the Harlem Renaissance still lingered in the air. Music poured out of churches, jazz clubs, and corner stoops. Gospel on Sunday morning, doo-wop on the block, jazz spilling out the basement windows at night. That's the soundtrack Nick grew up on, and it planted a seed deep inside him. Nick wasn't some prodigy who had everything handed to him. Nah, he struggled. School wasn't easy, money was always tight, and the idea of a career in music? That seemed like a dream too far. But he found refuge in the church. Man, those gospel choirs were everything. The way voices rose together, the way sound could heal a room, it hit him straight in the chest. That's where he learned the power of words, the power of a song to lift people up when they were hurting. By the time he was a teenager, Nick was already dreaming bigger than his circumstances. He tried his hand at different jobs, even thought about being a dancer at one point, but nothing clicked the way music did. He was searching, man, really searching for his purpose. He hung around theaters, listened to records until they wore thin, and kept that spark alive inside. Harlem was tough, no doubt, but it also gave him something priceless, a front-row seat to creativity, resilience, and raw soul. In the early 1960 period, Nick found himself homeless for a spell, wandering the streets of New York, sleeping in churches when he had nowhere else to go. That's crazy, right? The same man who would later write songs sung by Diana Ross was once just trying to figure out where he'd lay his head at night. But here's the thing, he never gave up. He wrote poems, scribbled lyrics on scraps of paper, kept dreaming even when reality tried to crush him. That determination, that faith, would carry him further than anyone around him could have imagined. And then destiny walked into his life in the form of Valerie Simpson. Valerie was this talented young musician from the Bronx, classically trained on piano, with a voice that could cut through the noise. They met at Harlem's White Rock Baptist Church, a place that wasn't just about religion, but community, creativity, and connection. Nick came in looking for direction, and he found a partner in every sense of the word. She believed in him, she saw something in him that maybe he hadn't even fully seen in himself yet. Together, they started writing, experimenting, and building something that was bigger than either one of them alone. Looking back, it almost feels like fate. Two souls from different corners of New York, colliding in a church basement, pen in hand, heart on sleeve. They weren't famous yet. They weren't legends yet. They were just Nick and Val, two dreamers scribbling down lines that would one day become the soundtrack of love for millions. That's the wild part, y'all. From the Harlem streets to gospel choirs, from being homeless to finding his other half, Nick Ashford's early life was a lesson in resilience. Every hardship was shaping him, preparing him for what was coming. And if you listen closely, You can still hear echoes of that Harlem gospel fire in every love song he ever wrote. Man, it's crazy to think about it. The world would one day see him as part of this iconic duo, but at the start, he was just a young man with nothing but faith, hunger, and a dream that refused to die. Man, if you thought Nick Ashford's early life was wild, wait till you hear about how he and Valerie started cooking up hits for Motown. This wasn't just some side hustle. Nah, this was them becoming the heartbeat behind some of the greatest soul records ever made. And the crazy part? For years, most folks didn't even know their names. After meeting at White Rock Baptist Church in Harlem, Nick and Val started writing together. They weren't Ashford and Simpson, the stars, yet. They were two hungry artists with notebooks full of lyrics and melodies, hustling to get anybody to take a chance on their songs. Their first little taste came when Ray Charles recorded their tune Let's Go Get Stoned in 1966. That joint hit #1 on the R&B charts. Man, imagine that your first big break is a #1 with Brother Ray. That was like a stamp from the heavens. The industry started whispering, "Who are these kids writing this fire?" Those whispers traveled all the way to Detroit, straight into the ears of Motown. And y'all know Motown in the 1960 period wasn't just a label, it was a factory of legends. Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, the Temptations, Smokey Robinson, hit after hit after hit. If you got your foot in that door, you weren't just writing songs, you were shaping the culture. And Nick and Valerie? They didn't just get in the door, they kicked it open. Their pen game was unmatched. Together, they wrote Ain't No Mountain High Enough, originally recorded by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell in 1967. Man, let me say that again, Ain't No Mountain High Enough. You can play that anywhere on the planet, and somebody's gonna start singing along. That song wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural anthem. It was about love, about faith, about believing no obstacle could break you. And it came from the minds of two young dreamers from Harlem and the Bronx. That's crazy. But they didn't stop there. Nah, they followed up with You're All I Need to Get By, another Marvin and Tammy classic in 1968. And then Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing. Over and over, Ashford and Simpson delivered records that defined what soul music was supposed to feel like. Love songs that weren't cheesy, but powerful. Lyrics that felt like conversations between two people truly in love. That was their magic. They weren't just writing songs, they were writing testimonies. And the singers felt it. Marvin and Tammy turned those songs into pure electricity, but the DNA? That was Nick and Valerie's pen. Diana Ross later recorded her version of Ain't No Mountain High Enough in 1970, and it went #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Think about that. The same song carried two different careers to new heights. And at the center of it all was Ashford and Simpson, still not household names, but already legends in the making. Inside Motown, they became known as the duo with the golden touch. They weren't flashy, they weren't trying to be front and center yet, but everybody respected their talent. Smokey Robinson once said Motown was about matching the right song to the right voice, and man, nobody did that better than Ashford and Simpson. They knew how to write for Marvin's smoothness, Tammy's vulnerability, Diana's glamour. They tailored every lyric, every melody, like a custom suit. But here's the thing, you know how people always say behind every great success there's someone who doesn't get the credit? That was Nick and Valerie. Their songs were topping charts, filling stadiums, playing at cookouts and weddings, and still, the average person didn't know who was behind them. That's the underrated part, man. Imagine writing the soundtrack to people's lives, and then walking down the street like any other face in the crowd. By the late 1960 period, Ashford and Simpson had written enough classics to retire if they wanted. But they weren't done. Nah, they were just getting warmed up. They had bigger dreams to not only be the pen behind the music, but the voices singing it. But make no mistake, their Motown era was their foundation. That's where they proved that love songs could be deep, spiritual, and revolutionary all at once. Think about it. The 1960 period was a time of civil rights marches, of communities fighting just to be seen as equal. And here comes these love songs, songs about unity, about devotion, about never letting go. They weren't just romance, they were resilience. They gave people hope when the world outside was hard. That's why those tracks still hit today. That's why when you hear Ain't No Mountain High Enough in a movie, in a commercial, in a stadium, you still feel that same fire. Man, the Motown years were where Nick Ashford transformed from a dreamer scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper to a certified architect of soul. And with Valerie right beside him, they weren't just making hits, they were making history. The irony, though? Even with all that success, the spotlight still wasn't on them. But that was about to change. Man, after proving themselves as the pen behind Motown's greatest hits, Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson were standing at a crossroad. They could have stayed comfortable in the background, collecting checks, writing for the stars, and living off royalties forever. But y'all know how it goes. Some voices are too powerful to stay hidden. Nick and Val weren't just writers, they had something to say themselves. And in the early 1970 period, they decided it was time to step out from the shadows and into the spotlight. At first, the industry didn't really know what to make of them. You had this tall, stylish brother with the flowing hair and deep presence, and this petite, classically trained pianist with a voice that could slice through a crowded room. They weren't packaged like the usual Motown act, but what they had was undeniable chemistry, both on stage and off. Their whole vibe screamed authenticity. They weren't trying to act like a duo, they were a duo. In love, in sync, every step of the way. Their early albums in the 1970 period, Gimme Something Real, 1973, I Wanna Be Selfish, 1974, and Come As You Are, 1976, set the tone. They weren't trying to chase trends. Instead, they leaned into what they knew best. Love songs that felt lived, in real, grown-up. Nick's baritone wrapped around Valerie's soaring vocals like a conversation between lovers. You could feel it, this wasn't just music. This was their marriage put on wax. And man, their stage presence? Wow. If you were lucky enough to see them live back then, you know what I mean. Nick wasn't just singing, he was preaching. He'd stand tall, eyes closed, hands reaching out like he was testifying in church. Valerie, meanwhile, was pure fire on the keys, commanding, elegant, and radiant. Together, they created an energy that was both tender and electric. It wasn't just a concert, it was like watching love embodied in sound. One of their early gems was Send It, 1977, which showed off their knack for blending soul with funk grooves. And then came Is It Still Good to Ya, 1978, an album that gave us the title track, a song later covered by Teddy Pendergrass. That joint became a quiet storm classic, full of intimacy and longing. Fans in the comments still talk about how Teddy tore that song up, but the original, that was Nick and Val pouring their hearts out first. By the late 1970 period, Ashford and Simpson were carving out their own lane. They weren't as flashy as disco acts. They weren't chasing pop formulas. They were building a reputation for honesty. Their music felt like relationship therapy, like a mirror held up to the joys and struggles of black love. And that mattered, man. Representation matters. In a world that often painted love between black couples as fragile or doomed, Nick and Valerie stood as proof that it could be powerful, enduring, and inspiring. And let's not skip over the fashion. Fans still remember Nick's look, the long, flowing hair, the suits that made him look like royalty. Valerie's elegance, her gowns, her quiet strength. Together they became style icons, a picture of black excellence that challenged stereotypes. Their look said, "We're here, we're proud, we're glamorous, and we belong." But here's the wild part, you'd think. With all those hits they'd already written for others, the industry would have rolled out the red carpet for them as performers. Nah, they still had to fight for recognition. Radio didn't always push their singles the way they should have. Award shows didn't always give them their flowers. They were always hovering between critical acclaim and commercial success, never quite getting the mainstream shine they deserved. And that's the underrated story right there. Still, they pushed forward. Songs like Found a Cure, 1979, and Street Corner hit hard with R&B audiences. Found a Cure even topped the Billboard dance charts. That was their thing. They could write a tender ballad that made you cry one minute, then a funky jam that had you sweating on the dance floor the next. Versatility, man. Pure versatility. And through it all, their love was the anchor. Fans felt it. When Nick looked at Valerie on stage, when Valerie smiled back at Nick mid-song, the audience could feel that bond. It wasn't fake chemistry cooked up for publicity, it was the real deal. One fan once said, "When they sang together, You could feel the love through the music. That's the truth. Their marriage wasn't just a private story. It was part of their art, part of their brand. By the time the 1980 period rolled in, Ashford and Simpson had built a loyal following. They weren't just the secret songwriters behind Motown anymore. They were Ashford and Simpson, a duo with their own catalog, their own tours, their own legend. And though they still weren't topping the pop charts the way their songs for others had, the foundation was set. They were ready for that one big record that would finally push them into the cultural mainstream. And man, that record was right around the corner. A little song called Solid was about to change everything. Man, if there's one song that stamped Ashford and Simpson into the mainstream consciousness, it's gotta be Solid. You hear those opening notes, that groove sliding in, and instantly, boom, you're transported back to the mid-1980 period. The song wasn't just a hit, it was a declaration. Solid. Solid as a rock. It wasn't about some fairy tale romance, it was about love that survives storms, love that's tested but unbreakable. And the wild part? That's exactly who Nick and Valerie were. They weren't just singing it, they were living it. When Solid dropped in 1984, it came during a time when R&B was shifting. The sound was evolving with drum machines, synths, and glossy production. Some older soul acts struggled to adapt, but Ashford and Simpson, man, they found a way to merge that modern polish with their timeless message. The result was magic. The track hit number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100, climbed all the way to number 1 on the R&B chart, and spread across the globe. Suddenly, Nick and Valerie weren't just the writers behind the scenes. They were on MTV. They were on TV specials. They were the faces of a love anthem the world couldn't get enough of. And it wasn't just a chart thing. Solid became part of the culture. It was wedding playlists, anniversary dedications, radio shout-outs. Couples claimed it as their theme song. Folks danced to it in living rooms, sang it at cookouts, and played it during slow dances at school proms. That joint crossed generations. Even today, you'll see comments online from people saying, "That was my parents' song," or "I was just a kid when that came out, but I'll never forget it." That's legacy in real time. The music video for Solid only amplified that energy. Shot in Central Park, it showed Nick and Valerie moving through the crowd, singing their truth as New Yorkers gathered around. No over-the-top gimmicks, no flashy special effects. Just two artists radiating authenticity. You could see the joy in their faces, the real connection between them, and people responded to that. In an era when so many acts leaned on image, Ashford and Simpson let their chemistry do the talking. It's wild to think about how long they had been grinding before that moment. They'd already written some of the most important songs in Motown history, dropped multiple albums as performers, and built a loyal fan base. But Solid? That was their breakthrough as household names. It pushed them out of the R&B lanes and onto the global stage. They even performed it on shows like Soul Train and Top of the Pops, bringing that love energy to living rooms across the world. And man, the timing of Solid was perfect. The 1980 period were full of power ballads and big anthems, but most of them came from rock bands or pop stars. Ashford and Simpson gave us a soul anthem that was equally big, equally universal. And let's be real, the song hit different because of who was singing it. Nick and Valerie weren't some industry-made duo. They were a married couple who had already been through the ups and downs, who had weathered storms together. When they sang "Solid as a Rock," you believed them because you could see it. That authenticity made the track bulletproof. But here's the crazy thing, even with a song that massive, they still didn't always get the industry recognition they deserved. Sure, Solid put them on the map as performers, but when award season came around, their names weren't always in the spotlight. That's been the recurring theme with Nick Ashford Story. Influence everywhere, flowers not given enough. Fans even now are still like, how do they not have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame? How are they not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? That's the underrated part that makes this story sting. Still, success isn't only measured in trophies. After Solid, Ashford and Simpson toured extensively, packing venues with fans who came to feel that love in person. And every night, when the band kicked into that chorus, the crowd would sing it back louder than the mics. Imagine being in that room, thousands of voices chanting "Solid as a Rock," with Nick and Valerie leading the charge. That's not just music. That's communion. What's more, Solid gave them crossover visibility. They appeared on talk shows, variety programs, even commercials. Their style, their presence, became part of pop culture. Nick's flowing mane of hair, his regal vibe, and Valerie's poise on the keys, they were instantly recognizable. They were proof that black love could be front and center, celebrated, and broadcast to the world without compromise. Looking back, Solid was more than just their biggest hit. It was the culmination of everything they had been building toward since those Harlem church days. It was gospel roots meeting Motown craftsmanship, meeting 1,980 production, all wrapped in the truth of their relationship. It was them finally saying, "We're not just writers, we're not just background, we're stars too." And man, isn't that the underrated story in a nutshell? You can create legends for others. You can pen the soundtrack of an era. But sometimes it takes one undeniable hit to finally put your own name in the lights. For Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson, Solid was that hit. It made them global, it made them iconic, and it made sure that no matter what, their love story would forever be tied to one of the greatest anthems of all time. Man, here's where the story gets even more interesting. Everybody knows Solid made Ashford and Simpson global, but what a lot of folks forget, or maybe never knew, is how much their presence spilled outside the music charts. These two weren't just singers and songwriters, they were cultural figures, showing up in film, TV, and even creating their own space for community through their famous spot, the Sugar Bar. Let's start with the cameos. Fans still remember seeing Nick and Valerie pop up on New York Undercover in the 1990 period. That episode, No Greater Love, had them performing right there on screen, blending fiction with real-life artistry. For younger viewers who maybe didn't grow up with their records, it was like discovering legends tucked into a gritty police drama. And you know what? That appearance wasn't about chasing clout, it was about authenticity. They fit in seamlessly because their music had always carried that street-level soul. Then there's Deaf by Temptation, 1990, a cult classic in the black film canon. Ashford and Simpson contributed to the soundtrack, reminding everyone that their artistry wasn't locked into one era. They adapted, they shifted, and they stayed part of the cultural fabric. That's what underrated legends do. They show up where you least expect them, but when you hear that voice or see that presence, you go, "Oh wow, that's them." But beyond the screens, Nick and Valerie were creating something even more lasting. The Sugar Bar. Opened in the 1990 period on Manhattan's Upper West Side, this wasn't just a restaurant. Man, this was a sanctuary, a place where music lived and breathed, where artists could come together, jam, eat good food, and feel community. The Sugar Bar became a hub for both established legends and up-and-coming talent. You never knew who you might see on that stage, maybe a famous singer dropping in, maybe a kid from the neighborhood getting their first shot in front of a crowd. Fans still talk about the Sugar Bar with so much love. One even said, "They had some good food, but more than that, they gave artists a space to shine." And that's the truth. Ashford and Simpson weren't just about their own careers, they were about lifting others. That's legacy work, right there. The kind of impact you don't always see written in history books, but you feel in the culture. Now, let's clear up a few things, because when you're talking about legends, myths tend to swirl. Some folks assume Ashford and Simpson were strictly behind the scenes, people who only had one hit as performers. Facts say otherwise. Their catalog as artists is deep. Found a Cure, It Seems to Hang On, Don't Cost You Nothing, and more. Solid might have been their crossover monster, but they had a steady run of beloved tracks that R&B fans still cherish. Another myth? That their fame was all about Motown. Nah. Yes, Motown was their launching pad, but Ashford and Simpson were far bigger than one label. Their writing, their performances, and their community work stretched across decades, across genres. They weren't trapped in that Motown nostalgia box. They kept creating, kept evolving. And here's the biggest fact that sometimes gets overlooked. Their art was inseparable from their love story. Industry duos come and go, but Nick and Valerie's bond was the engine. Their marriage wasn't just personal, it was professional fuel, a brand, a symbol. That's why their music hit so hard. You can't fake that kind of chemistry, man. You can't stage it. So yeah, the films, the TV appearances, the Sugar Bar, they weren't side notes. They were extensions of what Ashford and Simpson always represented: presence, love, and community. They weren't just artists stuck in vinyl grooves. They were living, breathing fixtures of culture. Whether you caught them on your TV screen, in a movie theater, or sitting at a table in the sugar bar with a plate of food and a microphone close by. And that's the real fact over myth. Nick Ashford wasn't just a background songwriter or a one-hit performer. He was a cultural architect, weaving himself into every space he touched. The cameos made sure younger generations kept discovering them. The sugar bar kept their legacy alive in real time. And the myths? Well, those just remind us that when you're truly legendary, people can't stop talking about you even if they don't always get the details right. Man, here's the part of the story that always hits hard. For all the joy Ashford and Simpson brought into the world, for all the hits that shaped Motown and beyond, the industry never quite gave Nick Ashford his full flowers. And that's the conflict baked into this whole journey, being celebrated, but not celebrated enough. See, Motown was a machine. It produced stars, it polished images, and it churned out records like no one else. But it also had its politics, its gatekeepers, its winners, and its forgotten. Nick and Valerie were miracle workers with a pen, but when it came to industry recognition, they were often treated like background players. Their songs made Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell immortal, gave Diana Ross a solo anthem, and influenced generations of soul singers. But ask the average person on the street back in the 1970 period, who wrote Ain't No Mountain High Enough? And most couldn't tell you. That's crazy, right? It wasn't just about credit, it was about how the industry prioritizes image over substance. Ashford and Simpson weren't flashy in the same way as, say, the Supremes. They weren't marketed as sex symbols or crossover darlings. They were songwriters who stepped into the spotlight on their own terms, and because of that, the machine never fully pushed them the way it pushed others. They had hits, sure, but awards? Those didn't stack up the way they should have. And let's talk about the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Fans still bring it up today. How do Ashford and Simpson not have a star? Man, they gave us cultural staples. They wrote for Marvin, Tammy, Diana, Ray Charles, Chaka Khan. They sang one of the most enduring love anthems ever in solid. And yet, no star. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Same story. They've been eligible for decades, but year after year, no induction. It's like the industry loves their work but forgets their names. This lack of recognition wasn't just some oversight, it was a reflection of how songwriters often get treated. People know the voices, not the pens behind them. And for a black couple in an industry already full of bias, it was even tougher. They had to carry themselves with grace while watching others bask in the spotlight their words created. That's the underrated tragedy, man. On top of that, the changing music landscape brought its own challenges. By the late 1980 and into the 1990 period, R&B was shifting toward New Jack Swing, hip-hop soul, and later, neo-soul. Ashford and Simpson were respected, but the radio wasn't pushing their new material the way it once did. Younger acts were dominating airwaves, and though Nick and Valerie still had loyal fans, they weren't getting the same platform. But here's what makes their story different from so many others: they didn't fold. They didn't lash out or fade away in bitterness. Instead, they created the Sugar Bar, a place where they could still pour into music and nurture new talent. That was their answer to being overlooked. Build their own stage, their own community, their own spotlight. Still, the tension remained. Imagine knowing you helped define the sound of Motown, that your lyrics are being sung at weddings, in movies, in commercials worldwide, and yet you're not on that walk of fame, not in that hall of fame. That gap between contribution and recognition is what makes Nick Ashford's story not just inspiring, but bittersweet. It also weighed heavy on fans. To this day, people write online, "They should have had 2 stars by now," or "How is Nick Ashford not honored among the greats?" That frustration is part of why his legacy feels so underrated. The people know, the fans know, but the institutions, the official bodies of music history, somehow missed the mark. And that, man, is the conflict that shaped the later years of Nick's career. Not personal scandal, not wild controversy, but something quieter, something more cutting. The slow realization that sometimes the industry you gave everything to won't give everything back. Man, if the struggles for recognition weren't heavy enough, Nick Ashford's final years came with another battle, one he couldn't just write his way through. Behind the stage lights and the smiles, Nick was facing something deeply personal, his health. By the late 2000 period, Nick had begun quietly dealing with throat cancer. For a man whose entire life had been built on words and voice, that diagnosis hit like a cruel twist of fate. Think about it, this was the same man who gave Marvin and Tammy the lyrics that made them eternal, the same man who stood next to Valerie night after night singing about love being solid. And now, the very thing that carried his art was under attack. That's heartbreaking, man. Still, Nick was never one to fold under pressure. Even as he underwent treatment, he kept showing up. Fans would still see him at the Sugar Bar, sometimes thinner, sometimes softer spoken, but always present. He made sure the community space he and Valerie had built stayed alive. That's strength, you know? To keep pouring into others when you're running low yourself, that's real courage. Valerie stood by his side through all of it. Their love, the same love they sang about for decades, became even more visible. She was his partner on stage, in the studio, and now, in the hospital rooms. It was the kind of devotion you can't fake. When they sang about love surviving storms, this was the storm. And they were still standing together, hand in hand. But the illness took its toll. Nick's once powerful frame grew frail, his voice sometimes reduced to a whisper. Fans who caught glimpses of him in those years knew something was wrong, but he carried himself with dignity. No dramatic announcements, no public pity, just quiet resilience. On the 22nd of August 2011, Nick Ashford passed away in a New York hospital at the age of 70. The news rippled through the music world like a shockwave. Even though he hadn't been topping the charts for years, his fingerprints were everywhere. Every time someone played Ain't No Mountain High Enough or Solid, that was Nick Ashford's spirit echoing. And suddenly, he was gone. The tributes poured in. Fans flooded comment sections, remembering the first time they heard Solid or how their parents danced to Marvin and Tammy's duets. Fellow musicians spoke about his genius as a songwriter, about how he and Valerie had given soul music its very language of love. People remembered not just his music, but his warmth. One fan wrote, "Nick was the coolest. I didn't know his face, but I knew the music. That says it all. His art outlived his fame, but in the end, the art is what really matters." Valerie carried the torch, even through her grief. At memorials and later performances, she spoke about Nick not just as her husband and partner, but as her soulmate. The love that had been so visible on stage was now the love she carried alone, but she carried it with pride. For her, every performance became a tribute, every note a memory. Nick's passing also reopened the conversation about recognition. Fans demanded again, why isn't Ashford and Simpson in the Rock Hall? Why don't they have their star? People wanted to see him honored properly, to make sure his name would not fade. In a way, his death reminded everyone just how much he had given and how much the world owed him back. And that's the bittersweet part, man. Nick Ashford left this world the same way he lived in it, gracefully, lovingly, quietly underrated. He didn't chase scandals or headlines. He poured himself into music, into Valerie, into community. And when the end came, it wasn't just the loss of a singer. It was the loss of a poet of love, a man who turned everyday devotion into timeless anthems. Even now, you can't listen to Solid without feeling the weight of his story. The line, "Nothing's ever gonna stop us now," hits different when you know Nick was fighting until the very end. His body may have given out, but his words, his songs, his spirit, they're still here, as strong as ever. Man, when we talk about Nick Ashford's legacy, we can't just stop at the songs. His and Valerie's biggest gift wasn't only what they wrote, it was the community they built, and nowhere is that clearer than at the Sugar Bar. Tucked on Manhattan's Upper West Side, the Sugar Bar wasn't just a restaurant. It was a movement. Nick and Valerie opened it in the 1990 period, and their vision was simple but powerful. Create a place where music, food, and love could live under one roof. They didn't just want a business, they wanted a home for artists. And that's exactly what it became. Walk through the doors of the Sugar Bar and you'd feel it. Warm lights, soulful decor, a stage tucked in the corner just waiting for magic. On any given night, you might catch a legend dropping by to perform, or a brand new talent getting their first break. It was that kind of spot, a crossroads where generations met. People didn't just come for dinner. They came for an experience, a taste of what Ashford and Simpson had always stood for. Love and music intertwined. Even after Nick's passing in 2011, Valerie made sure the Sugar Bar kept thriving. For her, it wasn't just about keeping the doors open, it was about keeping Nick alive through the music. She often said that when she's at the Sugar Bar, she feels his presence, feels him smiling down, and man, you can see it. Valerie on stage, still at the piano, still singing those songs, they land differently now. Every note carries memory. Every lyric is a love letter to the man who stood beside her for decades. The Sugar Bar also became a pilgrimage spot for fans. People who grew up on Solid or who danced to Marvin and Tammy's duets would come through just to soak in the vibe, maybe catch Valerie performing, maybe just to be in the space Nick helped build. It's not just a restaurant, it's a living, breathing piece of history. And that's the beauty of it. Some artists leave behind platinum records and awards, but Nick left something more tangible, a space where music could keep blooming long after he was gone. The Sugar Bar is proof that legacy isn't only about what you did, but what you made possible for others. Valerie understood that. She turned grief into fuel, keeping the flame alive not just for herself, but for everyone who still believes in the power of soul. Man, the thing about Ashford and Simpson is this. Even if you don't know their names, you know their songs. That's cultural impact on another level. Their words and melodies became part of the DNA of soul, R&B, and pop music. And the crazy part? Those songs keep finding new life, generation after generation. Take Ain't No Mountain High Enough. First, a duet for Marvin and Tammy in 1967, then a soaring solo anthem for Diana Ross in 1970, then covered and sampled countless times since. Every new version carries a piece of Nick Ashford's pen. Same with You're All I Need to Get By, Mary J. Blige and Method Man flipped it into a hip-hop classic in the 1990 period, introducing it to a whole new audience. That's what timeless songwriting looks like, elastic, adaptable, never losing its power. And it's not just covers. Their influence runs deep in the way R&B love songs are written. The blueprint they laid down, songs that balance romance with resilience, vulnerability with strength, still echoes today. You can hear it in Alicia Keys' piano-driven ballads, in John Legend's devotionals, even in Beyoncé's declarations of love and endurance. Ashford and Simpson made it cool to sing about commitment, about partnership, about love that lasts. Even Solid, their signature hit, continues to pop up everywhere. Commercials, TV shows, wedding playlists, man. It's like that song refuses to fade. Couples still pick it as their anthem. Young people still discover it and go, wow, that's what real love sounds like. That's cultural immortality. Their influence also shows up in the respect other artists pay. Teddy Pendergrass put his stamp on Is It Still Good to Ya? Chaka Khan found power in songs they gave her. Ray Charles trusted them with material. When legends line up to sing your words, that tells you all you need to know. And beyond the music, the image of Nick and Valerie themselves was legacy. They stood as a model of black love, of creative partnership, of style and grace. Fans still say, when they sang together, you could feel the love. That energy didn't just inspire songs, it inspired people's lives, their relationships, their idea of what love could be. So yeah, maybe the institutions haven't caught up yet, no star on the Walk of Fame, no Rock Hall induction, but the culture knows, the artists know, the fans know. And as long as those songs keep playing, as long as new voices keep carrying their words, Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson will never be forgotten. Man, when you look at the life of Nick Ashford, it's hard not to just sit back and say, wow. From the streets of Harlem, from those gospel choirs and those nights of sleeping in churches, he rose up to help shape the sound of a generation. He wasn't born into fame, he didn't have the machine behind him at first, but what he did have was resilience, vision, and love. Love for music, love for words, and love for Valerie Simpson. Together, Ashford and Simpson became more than just a duo. They were a movement, a statement. Their pen gave the world songs that still ring out Ain't No Mountain High Enough, You're All I Need to Get By, Reach Out and Touch, and so many more. Their voices gave us Solid, a love anthem that outlived the 1980 period and still fills dance floors and wedding halls today. And their presence gave us a model of what it looks like when black excellence, partnership, and creativity walk hand in hand. But here's the crazy part. The industry never fully gave Nick Ashford his flowers. No Hollywood Walk of Fame star, no Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. Even now, fans keep asking, how is that possible? How do you write the very songs that carried Motown into history, perform a global hit that everyone knows, and still not have your name carved in stone where it belongs? That's the pain of being underrated, man. That's the bittersweet truth this channel is here to uncover. Yet, in a way, maybe Nick didn't need those institutions to define him, because his real legacy is living where it matters most in the culture, in the people. Fans who still tear up when they hear Marvin and Tammy, couples who still claim Solid as their song, young artists who still study the blueprint of how he and Valerie wrote love songs that were deep and real. His impact is in the air we breathe when we talk about soul music. His influence doesn't need a plaque, it's already immortal. And let's not forget the Sugar Bar. That spot stands as a brick-and-mortar piece of his spirit. You can walk in, order a meal, hear live music, and feel like Nick is still there smiling from the corner. Valerie keeps that flame alive, sitting at the piano, singing their songs, carrying their love forward. That's legacy, too. A living, breathing reminder that even after death, Nick Ashford's story didn't end. So what do we take away from Nick's journey? Maybe it's this. Greatness isn't always about how loudly the world applauds. Sometimes it's about the quiet, steady impact you leave on people's hearts. Nick Ashford was proof that love, real love, can be the foundation of not just a marriage, but a career, a body of work, a cultural legacy. And now, we turn the question to you. Do you think Ashford and Simpson deserve that star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame? Should they finally be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? What's the one Ashford and Simpson song that still hits you deep every time you hear it? Drop it in the comments. We want to hear your memories, your stories, your songs. Because at the end of the day, Nick Ashford's name might not shine as bright as it should on paper, but in the hearts of fans, in the echoes of the music, in the couples swaying to Solid at their anniversaries, he's already legendary. And that's something no award, no committee, no industry gatekeeper can ever take away. Nick Ashford underrated, under-honored, but never forgotten. His story reminds us all. Talent may be overlooked, but true love and true art, that's forever solid.